Hello folks, my name is Carrot. I am a long-time World of Warcraft player, and in recent years have favoured the classic version of the game. At the time of recording, we're in the middle of Wrath of the Lich King Classic, and for the first time since the game's launch back in 2019, we're at a potential crossroads with where the game may go. So please, grab a brew and join me as we take a look at what possibilities may be ahead of us.
Agony. My hatred burns through the cavernous deeps.
Let's start with the obvious. Cataclysm, World of Warcraft's third expansion that originally released on December 7th, 2010. And sadly, the first point in the game's history where the player count didn't actively grow with a new release. Now, this has led to the consensus of a large portion of the player base, past and present, that Cata wasn't necessarily that good. But is that the case? Is Cataclysm as universally disliked as many would have you believe? Simple answer, no. It really isn't. Cata had its issues and low points, there's no doubt about it. Every expansion does. But with Cata, the most notable issues out of the gate were the poorly optimised 10-man raids, which, following the success of a smaller raid size of previous expansions, was a massive blow to many guilds, and the difficulty spike in the 5-man heroics department following the AoE smash and grab fests of Wrath was something the recently introduced LFG system struggled to handle. There were also overhauls to the talent system. Glyphs, despite being in the game only one expansion, saw large changes to their importance and how they were used, being able to be changed on the fly to suit the encounter at hand from a menu of already learned glyphs, instead of a system more akin to that of jewel crafting. And then there's the world that players up to this point have spent 6 years questing, exploring, PvPing and dying in was about to change, dramatically in some cases. This change to the world meant that Blizz could go in and update the classic zones to be more in line with the design philosophies of TBC and Wrath. This meant that the earlier levels were more streamlined, and instead of trekking to the far-flung corners of the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor for a particular quest chain because you're hunting for experience, every zone had enough quests and XP to get you to the next and then some. Stories for certain zones were updated and expanded upon from their vanilla counterparts, much like Westfall. And as such, the world did feel as if it evolved for the first time. The new player experience of Cata is also objectively a vast improvement in many respects, but was undeniably the beginning of the end for a challenging early game. Now let's talk content. In terms of sheer volume, Cata is unmatched in the amount a new expansion can bring right out of the gate. As mentioned with the old world overhaul, every vanilla zone was updated in one form or another. Some updates were certainly larger than others. For example, you've got the Barrens, Stranglethorn, the Thousand Needles. But when it came to the brand new leveling zones, Cata really didn't disappoint. The variation in design and location was heavily complemented by phasing technology. Now, this is something we'd seen sprinkled in certain Northrend zones in relation to incredibly specific chains like the Wrathgate, and it was used in some of the newly revamped vanilla zones a bit more liberally as well. In Cata as a whole, this technology was used as a vital storytelling component, allowing us to participate in important events as they happen and witnessing the outcomes, instead of just speaking to static quest givers and being told something we'd likely forget by tea time. And like Wrath before it, Cataclysm had 2 opening zones. So let's start with Vash'jir, WoW's first underwater zone. Certainly a polarising experience. Rather like Marmite, you either love it or you hate it. That being said, it is a graphically stunning zone due to its underwater nature. The design was also something Blizzard sadly never repeated in full, because the verticality that was added to combat wasn't a quiet taste, as having a Naga swing at empty space several feet below you yet still manage to give you a black eye, did not sit well with some folk. We would later see another quote-unquote underwater zone in BFA with Nazjatar, but due to some magical MacGuffin, we were more surrounded by water rather than under it. The second opening zone was Mount Hyjal, a zone that had technically been in the game from the very beginning, but never in a finished state. It was also a raid in TBC, but one that people would have actively avoided if they could. It is an area in lore that is significant to Warcraft's history, as it is where Archimonde met his end at the hands of the Night Elves, Orcs and Humans in Warcraft 3. In Cata, the zone was opened up once again. This time it was complete, and thankfully without the endless waves of horrid trash mobs designed to batter you into submission. The zone story followed the Green Dragons and Wild Gods as Deathwing and the Twilight Hammer tried to summon Ragnaros back into the physical plane, following his defeat in the Molten Core some years earlier. The zone culminates in Cenarius and co. pushing Ragnaros back into the Firelands.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
And then there's Deepholm, the realm of the earth, and a place I have wasted more time than I'd care to admit hunting down that bastard Stonedrake. It also happens to be where Deathwing had been hiding after one of his numerous ass-kickings. It's where our scaly friend burst forth from in the cinematic and began his concerted effort to drop dragon-sized turds all over the world from on high. The Twilight's Hammer crop up again, corrupting elementals and generally annoying Therazane the Earth Mother. It's rarely wise to piss off an elemental lord, but they give it a fair crack. Next up on the Cataclysm bucket list is Uldum, originally a Titan facility hidden away at the southern end of Tanaris. We were sent there initially after discovering the Discs of Norganon at the end of Uldaman, hinting at potentially a raid or something similar. Come Cataclysm though, it was reworked into an entire zone. Once a lush oasis, a Titan-made paradise, where the Keeper Ra and his Titan Forged conducted the Titan's business. However, due to a scuffle involving the Thunder King and the Zandalari, remember them, we'll see them later, the tropical landscape was effectively glassed and became Darth Vader's worst nightmare. The locals are descended from Ra's Titan Forged and ruled over by one King Ferris. From what I understand, he is a cat person's final form. And finally, the Twilight Highlands. Unsurprisingly, our fanatical friends in the Hammer Cult show up again, this time summoning angry teeth caves and making life just that little bit less pleasant. Horde and Alliance have their zone-mandated kerfuffle, and there's an arena where a Worgen rides in on a carriage intent on ripping your guts out through your nostrils. The Wild Hammer clan also make an appearance, but that's mainly so we can partake in Azeroth's version of Weddings from Hell. So, endgame. Endgame content did have its issues early on, as mentioned. 10-man raiding was just far too overtuned, and 10 heroic was a killer for many guilds in the 10-man sphere. Heroic dungeons were a level above what they had been previously, and harkened back to TBC heroics in their hardest incarnation, something for guilds or coordinated groups. This isn't a bad thing though. The issue here isn't really the difficulty. It's that the dungeons proved problematic for uncoordinated pug groups that were put together in the LFD system. This, however, did later change when the difficulty of the dungeons was nerfed, and while certainly not equivalent to Wrath heroics, they were a shadow of their former selves. In classic Wrath though, we have no LFD system. We have a group finder system based on something we would get later in the game's lifecycle. And if this system is maintained and improved upon, then we may find ourselves in a position where the harder 5-man heroics are what we get. especially if the Titan rune system is expanded upon. And with the difficulty of the revamped ZG and ZA in mind, it would truly be a fantastic time for 5-man content, particularly if the tuning is better out of the gate. And outside of the initial overtuning for Cata's first round of 10-mans, the expansion gave us some stellar raids. Even Dragon Soul had its moments. It was just let down by a disappointing final encounter with the big man himself, and a protracted final patch that dragged on for far too long. Firelands, for example, is an exceptional raid tier, and to this day, along with the related daily quests and zones, some of the fondest memories I have of that period of the game. The only thing Cata really lacked was perhaps a smaller, more accessible raid akin to the original Azjol Nerub or Uldum Man. It could be argued, so did Brath. But on that note, I point you to Trial of the Crusader. It rather fits the bracket of a neat mid-expansion catch-up to tackle alongside its bigger, more bombastic brother in Ulduar. With that in mind, however, it is known that originally 4.2 was set to be the Fire and Water patch. However, the Abyssal Maw raid that was set to release alongside the Firelands was said to be just a bit less impressive, and it incorporated elements of the zone of Vash'jir, which mentioned was a bit of a polarising place. Since this though, we've had the Eternal Palace and a boss which was completely underwater with the Blackwater Behemoth. At the time, I do recall this fight going down fairly well, and as long as the underwater features were sparingly used, Blizzard may be able to incorporate a smaller sister raid to the Firelands this time around, as was the original intent. So, to end this section, I'd like to ask, why Cataclysm? Well, to be frank, it is the natural next step in the classic timeline, the heir to what has come before. If Blizzard are set on re-releasing their older expansions with certain tweaks and changes to iron out any kinks that would perhaps not be acceptable to a modern audience, it could be a great success. The big issue with Cata though is the poor player perception. It is an expansion that is, in my opinion, unfairly ranked as one of the worst in the game's history. We have had a few stinkers since then that have done wonders for Cata's reputation, but in certain circles the perception that it's a pain in the arse still remains. It could be that going to Cata could, like the original, spell the beginning of a loss of players for classic WoW. So, if not Cataclysm, where will we go? What will we do? Well, there is Classic Plus. This is the idea of creating new content in the style of Classic WoW in the same vein as that of old school RuneScape. Given that we're already at Wrath, it would most likely be using that as the basis, a more complex version of Classic developed enough to allow for more intricate and dynamic content to be created, but classic enough to be recognisable to the player base. Classic Plus is not a new idea per se. It's been floating around since Classic launched, and it has been a concept that fan service have dabbled with since forever. I believe most recently it was Turtle WoW that has taken this idea and ran with it. It could be a fantastic thing for WoW as a whole, not just Classic, as a lot of people, myself included, have felt in recent years the game has diverted away from what made it great, and that the story and other aspects have just gotten a little bit too cosmic. Creating content in the Classic format, in the Classic art style, new raids, zones and so on designed around what the classic game is at its very core could show prospective players out there that WoW still has a few decent arrows left in its quiver and is worth devoting the time to. The great thing about Classic Plus is the endless possibilities. Unlike with Cataclysm, I can't just sit here and rattle off the pros and cons in the same way because we've never seen an official release of it. It's an idea, and only that. It's ephemeral, and that idea could literally be anything we want it to. And with that in mind, here are a few I think could be worth exploring. The Emerald Dream. Now, in Hyjal, we have seen bits and pieces of this admittedly, the Emerald Nightmare raid and the Dreamway from Legion. Both snippets of a hinted, larger puzzle. Dragonflight is also hinting heavily in the direction of future content within the Dream, be that a patch-style island or possibly something larger. What would be intriguing though is a Classic Plus expansion with the new content being designed around the classic Emerald Dream assets. As we know, these assets have been hiding in the game files since vanilla launched, and there are even concept screenshots out there if you look hard enough. Way back when though, Chris Metzen stated that the issue they had with creating the Dream was having a constant lush green landscape with little to no variation. Those are understandable concerns, but I think the art team at Blizzard are savvy enough to come up with interesting concepts on how to handle a classic Dream. Throw in some purples and blues, maybe a snowy peak or two, primal wildlife and wild gods thrown in for good measure. Next up, the South Seas. Yet another concept that has been hinted at many times throughout WoW's lifetime. And again, in fairness, we did get a small taste of it with Goltiris and Zandalar in BFA. However, what I have in mind is a touch more piratical. Think freehold, but island hopping from Tel Abyad, Kazan, a raid on the pirate stronghold of Plunder Isle. We could have a Barney with some local Naga and their sea monster minions. There might even be the odd horde or alliance ship. Maybe some long-lost sailors from either faction show up in port and take us on the voyage of a lifetime. Or Baron Revelgaz and his Black Water Raiders could use Booty Bay as a staging ground for an all-out war with the Bloodsail Buccaneers. Maybe there is some cursed treasure akin to that of Pirates of the Caribbean on Plunder Isle, and the chap in charge of the Bloodsail is using it to terrorise the South Seas. We as players are simply the hired help, mercenaries sent in to deal with this mid-level local threat. The Horde and Alliance aren't there at each other's throats, vying for territory or gain. This would be a pure and simple pirate fantasy, just with space goats and cow people. Next up, following on from the recent success of the Zaralek Caverns in Dragonflight, it could be a great time to introduce Azjol Nerub. It is widely known that originally the Nerubians were going to play a larger role than they did in Wrath of the Lich King, and as such they were going to be given their own subterranean zones. However, due to time constraints and other factors, this was reduced to a couple of dungeons and a final appearance of Anubarak in Trial of the Crusader. We could have an Explorers League expedition head down into the deepest depths of Northrend and even other areas of Azeroth with a high volume of Akir. We could have an Azerothian take on a hollow earth with weird and wonderful creatures, travel the world via underground tunnels and discover lost treasures, whilst also unearthing old horrors as we learn more about the old gods and their effect on the world itself and those under their control. The story of this area could be that of a Nerubian civil war. We saw snippets of this in Wrath with those that followed the undead Anubarak, a spider king who was revered in life and very much feared in undeath, waging war against those of his species who were still alive. A war of succession could take place throughout the course of leveling, and endgame content could be designed around the concept of who will become the next Spider King. And finally, the Great Reset. Another idea could be that once Wrath is done, it's done. Instead, we are offered a reset and go back to Vanilla Classic, but this time with some choice adjustments to build the foundations of Classic Plus. Content that never made it out of beta originally could be re-examined and implemented. The ideas previously touched upon could be added as future Classic Plus expansions after we've cleared the original vanilla content and whatever else is added in between. We could get a vanilla version of DKs, Draenei and Blood Elves right out of the gate, so both factions have access to Shamans and Paladins. Class balance could be a primary feature so that playstyles otherwise considered meme specs can be played and played well. It would also give the world and player base the opportunity to start afresh so that everyone experiences this version of the game from the beginning and not the middle or the end. It would also mean we could have content from the earliest levels added that we know nothing about. No guides or 20 years worth of kill videos showing us how it's done. Just before I end, I'd like to mention Hardcore. This player-driven game mode has been an immense success. It's even led to a resurgence in the classic era as a whole. It's hoped we will be seeing official Hardcore servers fairly soon, with their rules ironclad and baked into the game, because apparently choosing to endure endless mental and physical torture is not enough these days, and we need it forced upon us by a higher power. Hopefully though, this does show that Blizzard are up for listening to the community and taking the base model of Classic and doing something new and interesting with their product. And on that note, I'll end things for now. Let me know what you thought, and I hope to see you in the next one. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now.